Ράδιο άφοα. Φωνή στα ανίποτα.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of afoa podcast. We will once again discuss about the Palestinian issue, and we're happy to have with us today Lee Perlman, an academic from Israel, whose research has focused on the collaboration of Israel and Palestine, especially in the field of arts. Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andreas.
Just before we start, today is 6 November. We're already a month into this conflict. There have been 10,000 people killed in Gaza, according to Palestinian authorities. There have been 1,400 people killed in Israel, according to Israeli authorities. And we still have 200 people in captivity in Gaza by Hamas, and there's no updates on their condition. Lee, first I want to get your feelings on, how you've been experiencing this month already.
Well, I live in Tel Aviv, and I've lived here in the country for 40 years and in Tel Aviv for over 30 years. Actually, on the morning of the Hamas attack, I had woken up quite early, and I was gearing up towards going to our liberal synagogue, just a walk away from our apartment in Tel Aviv, to celebrate the end of the major Jewish festival that was to be celebrated. And of course, that was canceled. That first day involved a lot of frenetic WhatsApp communications, obviously with friends and family, but specifically with two sets of friends who live on two of the kibbutzim that were attacked, and both of those sets of friends actually survived those attacks, each with specific stories. So I share this with you because beyond whatever perspectives I share with you, and then we discuss, there are obviously lots of personal connections. Over the first few days, after there were lots of rumors and a lot of people were trying to figure out who of their friends or loved ones were at the music festival where mostly young people were killed at one of the kibbutzim. It became clearer and clearer who had been killed as opposed to who'd been abducted. And again, these are people, since Israel, even though there are 10 million people here, it felt during those first few days as someone with different social circles that was a much smaller and tighter community. And then sadly, again, I know some of the people who were kidnapped, and mostly other kidnapped abductees are either friends of friends or children of friends. So it's so I'm not immune, and so when I look at this analytically, I am affected. We have in our apartment block, we have a bomb shelter on the floor. It's not that common to have one on the actual floor that's shared by 4 flats. And so during most of this last month, we've been kind of walking briskly when there's a siren, and it's been part of our experience. And as lastly, including public activity, lots of events now on a much more feverish pace, trying to express solidarity with the family of the abductees, and also protests to stop the war. And so I'm, as a kind of a foot soldier, as I often tend to call myself, for peace and human rights, I'm also engaged at that level as well.
Yeah, I think nobody's immune to what's been happening. I mean, I know friends here who have not been sleeping very well these last months, that are waking up in terror, in the middle of the night, or that are on guilt trips that, we can sit and enjoy a beer while others just a few kilometers south cannot. So what you're saying, what you're describing is totally reasonable. I wanted to ask you, what was the situation before 7 October? Because it seemed like Palestinian issue was not even a story until that morning.
It's very true. The Palestinian issue had been explicitly sidelined by all of the coverage and attention given to the potential of a U.S., Saudi Arabia, Israel normalization pact that had a lot at stake in terms of trade, obviously diplomatic implications. It's been said by many, many analysts and pundits that one of the, if not overarching goals of the Hamas, but certainly one of the byproducts of the Hamas attack and now of the war, is that the Palestinian issue, which has kind of perennially been pushed to the side over these last 6 or 7 years of these last iterations of the Netanyahu government, especially with the normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, etc., under the Trump administration, the Palestinian issue was not a major focus. I'll even go further and say that peace as such was not an issue. Most of the folks in Israel, talking about the Jewish Israelis and also the Palestinian citizens of Israelis alike, have been much more engaged, and I include myself, in issues around human rights, around spotlighting the problems that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been experiencing, as opposed to offering solutions. So the whole sort of solution discourse, even within the peace camp, which has been very beleaguered since the failure of the Oslo peace process, and peace as a kind of I'd say a very weak brand, if you will, even amongst its major proponents. The major focus of peace-oriented Israelis, Jews and Palestinians alike, has been to end the occupation per se, and for many it's to stop the apartheid, for those who frame it in those terms, as opposed to let's create or build peace. That, which I'll be happy to get into, has actually changed now. The war has actually kind of shifted the focus to include a peace discourse.
And would you say that there's been, let me rephrase it, in the last, as you say, basically after the 2014 war, peace efforts haven't been really on the agenda. There were no real negotiations between the two states, or between Israel and the PLO. Why do you think that happened? Doesn't Israel have to benefit from a peaceful solution?
The Israeli government, including the current Israeli government, and again, we have to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu is now the prime minister of his 8th government. That includes 7 since 2009. And in addition, the first government from 1990, end of 96, early 97 to early 99. So he really has been calling the shots for a really long time. And what, in my field of peace and conflict studies, this whole notion of conflict management has been the paradigm. And from day one of this war, conflict management, or the so-called strategic goal of Israel trying to achieve quiet, not peace, but quiet with the Hamas, has been completely debunked. And this was not a paradigm, it was the paradigm of the military security complexes, the governments, of the most of the opposition in the Israeli parliament also ascribed to the conflict management paradigm, which partly explains the potential comeback of a peace paradigm.
Yeah, because I remember before October 7th that Netanyahu was actually quite in the corner with corruption allegations, with the resistance of the Israeli people against the reforms he was promoting in the judiciary system. What happened to all of that?
Right. Well, first of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu is still on trial. The court system is not working overall particularly actively now, except a little on Zoom, but he is still on trial for actually three different crimes that he's been accused of bribery, fraud, and breach. There are three separate cases, each going at a different pace. That it's impossible to look at this situation without remembering that. And also the second piece that you referenced, Andreas, which is his current government's attempt at what they call judicial reform, and what the very broad-based set of protesters were calling essentially a judicial revolution or overthrow, an attempt by the government to pass laws that would weaken to a very severe extent the Supreme Court and the court system in general. Those issues are still alive. They're out there in the media, and you'll often see now over the last few days in Jerusalem and a bit in Tel Aviv demonstrations where alongside, adjacent to a solidarity tent with the families of the abductees, you'll also see a demonstration calling for Netanyahu's resignation, referencing those corruption charges. And interestingly, many of the groups that were at the forefront of this now suspended 9-month weekly set of demonstrations throughout the country, and often with hundreds of thousands of people coming out, they have pivoted, and they are now using all their logistical volunteer resources to support civil society in Israel, primarily the families that have been evacuated, the families of those whose loved ones have been kidnapped, who've been killed. And you see groups like the Brothers in Arms group, the ex-combat soldiers whose controversial issue on the American news program 60 Minutes really caused a lot of waves in many circles. Their group has taken over the major exhibition center, not very close to where I'm sitting now in my home, the Expo Center in Tel Aviv. The whole parking lot is a volunteer setup where people are contributing foodstuffs and all sorts of other needs of different families who've been affected by the war, and then subsequently distributing them. So there are these layers are still there. In fact, just yesterday, Netanyahu was allegedly accused of calling for an inquiry after the war about the extent to which the call for refusal to serve in the army if certain laws were passed, in fact, encouraged the Hamas to attack. And he was then immediately criticized by many for even calling for a sort of a causality of that extent, and so there's still a lot of politics. This is basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
There's still politics going on. The overarching narrative is, will Netanyahu survive? That's still out there. It's competing with, what is the overall goal of this war? Can Israel achieve the goals of this war? And thirdly, will Israel do all it can to bring back the abductees. Those are the three sort of meta-narratives that are competing with each other. Peace is not one of the meta-narratives, but it's there.
Unfortunately, but what you've been saying has prompted a lot of questions in my head. Are the voices of those calling for the return of the hostages being heard enough? Because Israel's operation in Gaza now, and I think it's an official record and now, isn't really prioritizing the return of the hostages. Is the goal is eradicating Hamas.
Yes.
And B, if you do eradicate Hamas, which is a very easy thing to say, but is already causing much more consequences than just eradicating Hamas, quote unquote, will it create a better tomorrow for Israel and Palestine, or will it create even more radical resistance, let's say, to Israel's policies?
Well, you're framing the questions very constructively. Unfortunately, in most of the mainstream media, which at the end of the day is susceptible to the government positions and the government propaganda, the government propaganda isn't framing it in the way that you asked your question now. Anytime the issue comes up of the implications of these attacks, the death of children and elderly and women in Gaza, of innocent Palestinians, any attempt to even contextualize the Hamas attack in Israel's policies towards Gaza since the 2005 disengagement, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon led a government decision to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza, and then shortly after elections were held and the Hamas was elected and became the overseer. There's again debates: is Gaza a state or not? It's obviously not officially a state, but the government has been so single-minded, as you correctly pointed out, in this toppling, destroying, a lot of different words, eradicating Hamas, without often a lot of clarity about what that will actually achieve, or what's often been called here the day after. In other words, the day after question is being asked, but similarly to the kidnapped question, is being trumped, if you'll excuse the pun, by the eradicating of Hamas. So the government's official position as of today is, yes, we care about the 200, and the number now is apparently 240. It might be a little more, it might be a little less, but I think most observers see the eradicating Hamas goal as not necessarily being consonant with freeing the abductees. But the official government position is, yes, the way we are going to free them is by eradicating Hamas. And there's a battle going on. I mean, as we're speaking now, a major demonstration outside of the Israeli parliament is just finished. Okay, I'm here with you now, so I'm obviously not there. The daily and gatherings outside the Tel Aviv Museum in Tel Aviv, where dozens of tents where families are now living, are now camping out, where there are installations with a long Friday night Sabbath dinner table with empty chairs. In the major National Theater Square, another installation of over 200 beds of children and adults who've been abducted. In other words, there is a major effort with a lot of very savvy media professionals as well, and political strategists who are working with the families. But then again, amongst the families, there are those who are advocating for, let's do a massive prisoner deal and return all, not just the Hamas prisoners, all of the Palestinian prisoners in what used to be called the Intifada jails, in the Israeli jails, as opposed to those who are saying we have complete support for the government. So it's there is a battle for attention, but I have to say that the mainstream media is from my subjective perception, is really sort of going back and forth. whose stories they're telling, more stories of bravery of soldiers, because now Israeli soldiers are beginning to be killed. And the last point I want to bring up is that there are tens of thousands of Israelis who've been evacuated from the north of Israel, both from the Western Galilee along the Mediterranean Sea, going easterly under the rest of Lebanon, under Syria, who have also been evacuated. This is unprecedented.
Yes.
There are reports of anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000 Israelis altogether who've been evacuated. And that only includes around the 30,000 or so Israelis from the kibbutzes
around Gaza,
along the Gaza border. So I'm not in a position to know how effective, but as I have a close friend whose daughter and son-in-law were kidnapped, I know that he has been in the United States with delegations, and there are delegations in Los Angeles, and there are attempts, and there's a clash here. There's definitely a clash of policy and priorities, and obviously also of the narratives.
And we've seen the state of Israel, I mean, the government response not being very productive or not very favorable to these voices of opposition within the country, even if they come from families of the abductees. Like, I've seen reports saying that the police is now authorized to shoot at demonstrators in Israel who oppose the war. You've described before situations where people are ignored, essentially. Is there an end game to what the government is doing here, there?
Okay. Well, first of all, you referenced, police being able to shoot. There was legislation that was actually toppled in the parliament, thankfully. The talk of legislation also has a very negative effect, obviously. And there's, it's not a coincidence that most of the protests against the war have been framed as affirmative gatherings of solidarity between pro-peace and pro-human rights individuals and groups in Israel. So their branding, if you will, Andreas, is solidarity between Jews and Palestinians, between those of us who want to reaffirm our humanity and reaffirm our belief in peace. There's, it's not easy being a Palestinian Arab citizen in Israel now, who, by the way, for those who aren't familiar, constitute a little more than 20% of all of the citizens. And these are citizens of the state of Israel. I'm not relating to the to the Palestinians who live in the West Bank in Palestine, or of course the over 2 million in Gaza. But we're talking about over 2 million Palestinian Arabs, and a number of them have had runs-in with the police. Some have already been put on trial because of some social media posts that weren't explicitly supporting the Hamas, but were interpreted as being, if not empathic, certainly kind of trying to contextualize this. And as I was saying before, even attempts to contextualize why this all happened and how we got here are often seen as anti-government, anti-the war effort. And so there's a very fine line that even many Jewish Israeli citizens. I participated a little less than 2 weeks ago in a gathering of Jewish and Palestinian theater artists in a shared theater space in Jaffa. And the first major thing that was discussed was freedom of expression and freedom of speech. What are we going to do in the artistic community to ensure that we all have this freedom of expression and speech, and that others, including many of my colleagues' students, who are also sort of running scared, if you will, in how they express themselves publicly. What is the end game? It's the most important question, because as I said before, the conflict management paradigm is dead. It's been given a hermetic seal of death, certainly by the media. Okay. And I'm aware when we look at the peace camp, we have to also look at top-down groups, at policy development groups that have really not filled so much of this void of the last decade. The groups that have kept peace alive and the anti-occupation alive have been grassroots groups. Many of them cross-border between Palestine and Israel, but many within Israel. But now more and more of the think tanks in Israel are, because of this vacuum, are trying to gain, and some gaining direct access, at least to the Ministry of Defense. It's, again, very ironic. The Ministry of Defense, who are spearheading this war effort, are the most open to endgame questions, to these key strategic questions. So the major approach that's been floated, which the government has officially rejected, is re-empowering and re-engaging with the Palestinian Authority, and that Mahmoud Abbas himself would be engaged perhaps with other Palestinians. Again, this is not the government position. These are ideas that are being developed in some of the think tanks. Some of them are centrist, by the way. They're not all. A lot of them are made up of former military leaders, heads of intelligence and such, but some of them are clearly pro-peace left-wing think tanks. So there's much more engagement around it, but there's also a conventional wisdom, which I agree with, that this government is not going to be capable of engaging with any Palestinian entity in a new situation, which then brings us back to the question you raised before, the political possibilities of change. And there are winds out there of change for a center soft right government to be replaced to replace the current government even without elections. There's a lot of talk around that. So the politics are interfacing with these broader strategic questions like the ones you brought up. And again, I don't want to overstate the influence of the peace groups and the think tanks. We're there. There's more need for these voices. There's more need for these policy blueprints, if you will. And I'm not in a position to know how open some of the key officials are really to these attempts to get them to think about the end game.
It's quite ironic, actually, because I remember even before October 7, that a lot of criticism towards Netanyahu's administration was coming from the military, and it was coming from senior army officials who were saying, "We will not serve for you. We will not follow your orders."
Yes,
and
all true.
And that just after an attack, not one attack, it was a huge attack. It was an attack that hasn't been seen maybe since the Nakba War, or since the Yom Kippur, yes.
And again, a lot of the references since the Yom Kippur War took place literally 50 years ago. All the issues around actually what happened, something we didn't get into this conversation, of how was Israel not prepared. Again, this has not just been a focus of the peace groups, but some of the peace groups, like Peace Now, for example, have been putting out a lot of infographics and a lot of propaganda to show how Israel's policy of developing and building more settlements was directly responsible for the lack of military readiness, because almost all of the battalions that were supposed to be along the Gaza border had been moved to the West Bank. And this is something that the government debates to what extent that's true, but it's really important to remember Netanyahu formed a government of 64 members, which is a little above the 61 that one needs. And it's a very stable government. And that is one of the reasons that there's not a lot of optimism for a sort of a period of political instability, because he's put together a very monolithic government, which includes two extreme right-wing nationalist party, one which is a self-defined Jewish supremacy party called the Jewish Power Party, the Otzma Yehudit Party. And this is the coalition that he put together. And and while the center and soft right critics of Netanyahu are completely supporting the war effort, they're not going to publicly speak about peace. Okay, the head of the former defense minister and chief of staff who actually joined the war cabinet, Benny Gantz, is a part of the government now. He and his party, the center soft right party. The other center party, there is a future party, Yesh Atid, did not join this, but his party, which is, he's the official head of the opposition, they are not going to oppose the war effort. They're only sort of trying to challenge the government to be clear about the question you ask is, what's the end game? The end game can't be eradicating Hamas. It's not clear what that is. Is it security? They're very careful about using the word peace. Peace is a beleaguered term here. So that's the paradox of peace making a comeback, but in baby steps, but also still really being seen as either naive or counterintuitive. Even when former Mossad or Shabak or even chiefs of staff talk about the need to be thinking about peace.
I wanted to ask you, has there been, one of the most important methods to resist a war is conscientious objection, and I know there's a strong movement in Israel. Has there been an uptick after October 7 when everybody was essentially called to go into the army as reservists?
Well, I'm not aware of any certainly publicized conscientious objection since October 7th, or of any soldiers who've refused to serve. I'm not saying I'm the authority on this issue, but there are enough open news sources in the left that I think would expose that if it happened, would want to share that, in fact. This is as opposed to what you referenced before, which were the hundreds of senior Israeli reservists who either had officially or unofficially declared that they would not show up for reserves if the government went through with its judicial reform. And so the talk of refusing to serve as a reservist was not only very widespread, it became even bon ton. It even caused Netanyahu himself and many ministers in his government saying that we'll always be here, but we don't need all the pilots. And I'm paraphrasing some quotes that, again, really upset them. And so now when also Netanyahu begins to point fingers at the defense establishment for not being prepared and not taking responsibility, as he's constantly being asked in the media to take responsibility for what happened, for the lack of readiness. He is being attacked again and again by these former combatants. So there are a lot of layers here. There's the pain that this society is feeling around the kidnapped, with the kidnapped families. What many people are experiencing here as a kind of existential threat. Now, it's a paradox because, Israel is a military superpower, and we can all see the human and physical destruction that the Israeli Defense Force is wreaking on Gaza and on the people of Gaza. I mean, there's no way one can avoid that. So this is not a new situation, but it's perhaps just a bit more extreme than in the past. And again, it has to do with this sense that the sort of the unwritten understanding that Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, in other words, the Jewish state here, brought with it a feeling that Jews would not be vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, to what are being often referenced to as pogroms here, or even to the Holocaust, a lot of use of Holocaust imagery. Mm-hmm. Netanyahu has talked about this war as our second war of independence. This is language that's being used to mobilize the public. And
sensationalistic language.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's quite effective because it's tapping in. One doesn't have to be a social psychologist or a political psychologist to understand that playing into the fears, and this is an expertise of Netanyahu, and this comes down to my major point that I want to share with you and your listeners. Netanyahu has consistently stayed in power, not just because he's a masterful politician and he knows how to maintain stable coalition governments, and he's a brilliant orator and presenter and PR strategist, all these known qualities. It's because he's succeeded in defying the conventional wisdom that politicians should sell hope, should be offering a trajectory of where a society could be moving towards, of a better future. That is not what he's been selling. Here now we have a situation which is so stark, where we're in this bloody, terrible war with all of the human tragedy, with all of these emotions and anxieties and fears, with a very lively debate, but in many ways a very sad debate within the Israeli left, where many of the left, the Jewish Israeli left, are saying, I feel bad, but I don't really feel bad for the Palestinians. I know that not all Palestinians in Gaza support Hamas, but there's a lot of that being talked about. And then there's a lot of debate, and it's mostly in the left-wing Jewish media. But here, hopefully, is going to make a comeback. There are these buds now that hope as a aspiration, as a value, what in my field, a colleague of mine from the United States, John Paul Lederach, calls the moral imagination. Okay, this is this notion of how, while being grounded in reality, we can imagine a different future, okay, and then aspire to it. And that involves hope being there. Most of that hope energy, though, is being garnered towards bringing home the hostages. But there's lots of discussion about that hope energy also being garnered with the help of the families to toppling the Netanyahu government and maybe bringing in a new center, soft right, not a left wing by any chance, but a center, soft right political leadership.
Well, I think certainly from our view, our hope is for a ceasefire as soon as possible, certainly releasing hostages, releasing unfairly detained people in Israeli prisons as well. And thankfully, hopefully, this won't drag on, because my fear is that this will not end very soon. Thank you very much for your very informative discussion with us, Lee, and I hope we will catch up together again soon.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ράδιο, άφοα, φωνή στα ανίποτα.